So hello and welcome to today's session of the UT Global Studies series on the US and the global in the US. My name is Paul Gellert. I'm the Director of Global Studies here at UT and Associate Professor in the Department of Sociology. And with Asafa Jalata, who's a Professor of Sociology as well, we are very delighted to co-host today's webinar, and we're happy to see a bunch in the audience for it. We are recording, as I just said, and we will post this later to our YouTube channel. This is the fifth in our series that we're organizing this year on that theme. As usual, before we start, I have to make a series of thank yous to a bunch of sponsors that made this possible, and unfortunately, the circumstances didn't make it possible to bring you all physically here, but the advantage is we have a three-person panel to discuss these issues today. So first to the Haynes Morris Endowment Fund, which is our key sponsor, the Center for Global Engagement, and Daisy Chen, who helped with flyers, the Departments of Sociology, History, Political Science, and Anthropology, the interdisciplinary programs in Africana Studies, Asian Studies, Latin American Caribbean Studies, and Middle East Studies. I also want to thank our committee, some of whom I think may be joining later. Jorge Olson is here in the crowd, Asafa Jalata, I've already introduced, Tamara Gilbertson, and our two undergrad Global Studies Club leaders, Callista Boyd and Lily Hardwick. So you can follow us via our website, globalstudies.utk.edu, our YouTube channel, and a Facebook page that is fed by our student club leaders. So thus far in the series, we have focused largely on social and economic connections, particularly in the Southeast region of the United States with the rest of the world, issues like immigration and transnational corporations and race. Today, we turn to the geopolitics and histories of US intervention in the world. And we do so by focusing on the sordid history of intervention in three regions of the world, Southeast Asia, particularly Indonesia, the Horn of Africa, and Latin America, particularly Ecuador. In each of these regions, the US has supported political change via direct, indirect, covert, and overt means. And in the process, huge numbers of people have been displaced, had their lives overturned, and hundreds of thousands have been killed, often in the name of democracy and/or development. So why look back on these historical interventions in 2021? One reason is the recent change in leadership in this country. President Biden, in his February 4th speech on America's place in the world, declared, "America is back. Diplomacy is back at the center of our foreign policy." On the other hand, Sidney Lenz's The Forging of American Empire shows how the US, from the time it gained its independence, has used every available means, political, economic, and military, to dominate other peoples. In his speech, Biden also spoke of plans to host the Summit of Democracy to, quote, rally the nations of the world to defend democracy globally, to push back authoritarianism's advance. But the US has a blemished record of supporting authoritarian governments and opposing democratically elected governments, especially if they are socialist or leftist or otherwise not aligned with the dominant interests of American capitalism and hegemony. At the same time, 2021 is not 1965. And we're interested in how the current era might differ from previous eras. Tom Engelhardt, who writes the Tom Dispatch blog, wrote recently, "In the most literal sense possible, the Donald was our first presidential candidate of imperial decline, and so a genuine sign of the times. In its own distinctive fashion, the US is going down," he continued, "and will do so whether Donald Trump, Joe Biden, or Mitch McConnell is running the show." In that light, we've asked our speakers to think about four questions today in relation to their research. First, what do most Americans not know about political military intervention in their region and why, including things such as suppression of data or difficulties getting data? Second, did intervention achieve its aims from the US perspective? Who benefited and who lost from these interventions? And third, in a time of rising significance of China, but also India and Russia and other world powers, how is intervention changing or not changing in all three regions? And finally, fourthly, who can resist US intervention in the world and how? How best might that be done. And I should say, we pose these questions, but our speakers may engage with one or more of them, and not all of them. We didn't assign them to answer each one of them. Lastly, I'd say we're running this as a Zoom meeting. We finally have video for all of us, so good to see you. And since we're running it as a meeting and not a webinar, we can see all of you. It's great that you all have your pictures off during the meeting, and during the first part, I should say, during the speakers' formal presentations, and then afterwards we'll have time for discussion, and we'd love to have you turn your videos back on and have a discussion together. So now, before we get started, we want to give brief introductions to the three speakers. We're going in the order of the flyer. And so first, Geoffrey Robinson is professor of history at University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA. His career began with 6 years working at Amnesty International, and that early work continues to shine through his writing and teaching about political violence, genocide, human rights, and US foreign policy. Dr. Robinson earned his PhD in 1992 at Cornell University, studying with George Kahan and Benedict Anderson, the doyens of Indonesian studies in the United States. His books include The Dark Side of Paradise, and I have a couple of these on my bookshelf, about political violence in Bali from 1995. If You Leave Us Here, We Will Die, How Genocide Was Stopped in East Timor, and most recently, The Killing Season, A History of the Indonesian Massacres, 1965-1966, which just very recently was awarded the 2021 George McTee Prize for the most prestigious, for the best book in Southeast Asian studies. And this is the most prestigious award in the field, so congratulations. Second, Asafa is going to introduce Bonnie Holcomb.
Okay, let me introduce my friend Bonnie Holcomb. Oromos call her Kabanne. Bonnie Holcomb is a senior research associate at the Center for Communitarian Studies of the George Washington University at Washington, D.C. She is an anthropologist who specializes Oromo, Ethiopian, and African studies, particularly Western intervention in the Horn of Africa. Bonnie co-authored with late Sisa Ipsa The Invention of Ethiopia, The Making of a Dependent Colonial State in Northeast Africa. This is a groundbreaking book. It has a lot of influence on many people. She also co-authored another book titled Politics and the Famine, 1984 to 1985, with Jason Clay. Her articles appeared in several regional global journals, and welcome with me, Bonnie Holcomb. Thank you.
Thanks, Asafa. And third, we'll have Marc Becker, who is a professor of history at Truman State University in Missouri. He has an extensive website. If you want to see everything that he's doing, it's fantastic. He's also a member of Historians for Peace and Democracy, whose mission is to stand up for peace and diplomacy internationally and for democracy and human rights at home. His two most recent books are the FBI in Latin America, the Ecuador Files, and the CIA in Ecuador, 2017 and 2020 from Duke University Press. And he's also written extensively on indigenous movements and social movements in Latin America. And I have to give a shout out to my colleague and former director of global studies, Michael Handelsman, for suggesting that we invite Marc to this event. I don't want to take any more time. I want to turn it over to our speakers and just I'll give their titles. They've each been allotted a max of 20 minutes, and then we can have discussion afterwards. During their talks, feel free to post comments or questions in the chat, and we will collect them. Dr. Robinson will be speaking on Psywar, Guns and Silence, US Intervention and the Indonesian Genocide of 1965-66. Dr. Holcomb will speak on the many faces of US intervention in Ethiopia, past, present, and projected. And Dr. Becker on Ecuador under the imperial gaze of the FBI and the CIA. So the floor is yours, Jeff.
Great. Thank you so much, Paul, and everybody for being here. Before we begin, is it going to be possible for me to share my screen? It says host disabled participant screen sharing. Is it possible that I can share my screen?
On my part, I did.
Okay, I'm changing it to now. All participants should go now.
Okay, let me give that a try. There we go. Okay, is that visible now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Great, okay. So as Paul has said, I'm going to speak today about a case, a story that I kind of am venturing to say a lot of Americans don't know anything about, and that is the mass killing and mass incarceration of communists and other leftists in Indonesia in the mid-1960s. This was, I think it's fair to say, one of the largest and also the least known instances of mass violence and certainly of anti-leftist violence in the post-war period. But let me, before I talk about the US role, let me first give you a quick summary of what happened in 1965-66. So, and before I begin, in case you don't know, just to remind people, this is Indonesia, everything that's white on the map. So it's sort of south of Thailand and China and north of Australia. In about 6 months between late 1965 and early 1966, something like 500,000 Indonesian communists and leftists were killed, and another 1 million or so were detained without charge or trial, and many of those were subjected to torture. The immediate pretext for this campaign of violence was the arrest and killing of 6 army generals on the morning of October 1st, 1965. The remaining army generals claimed immediately that it was the Communist Party that had detained and killed the generals in an attempt to seize power. And based on that still unproven claim, the army set out to annihilate the PKI and also to overthrow the popular left nationalist president, Sukarno. Sukarno's figured there on the right and on the left is just one of the many burning campaigns that took place against PKI facilities. The campaign was led by a general, an army general featured there, the one in camouflage, Major General Suharto. He soon became president, and he remained in power for more than 3 decades before being forced to step down in 1998. In its scale and its significance, I think it's fair to say that this was one of the most notorious campaigns of mass killing and incarceration in the post-war period. And yet, and this is an important point, this violence remains virtually unknown outside of the United States, and certainly needs to be emphasized, it remains unpunished. So one of the central questions surrounding these events of mid-1960s is whether the United States and its close allies played any role in this violence, and also whether it played any role in the long silence that followed the violence. So I'm going to address those questions here today. That's the main thing I'm going to do. But toward the end, what I want to do is outline where things stand today and what anybody should or could be doing about it. So trying in some way to address some of the questions that Paul posed earlier. So needless to say, the United States and other Western governments have vehemently denied any involvement whatsoever in the violence of 1965, and they have done their best to obscure the issue by keeping key documents secret. But the documentary evidence that we do have from both US and British and some other archives shows unequivocally that in the years before the alleged coup of 1965, and in the weeks and months and years after it, the US and its allies actively encouraged the violence. So in the interest of time, I want to focus here just on the period after the coup of October 1965. There's certainly much that could be said about the period before. But in this later period, US encouragement of the violence took essentially 4 forms. You see them listed there: secret assurances to the army, a Psywar operation, covert economic and military assistance to the army, and strategic silence in the face of the violence. I want to look quickly at each of these before then turning back and talking about what we might do about it. So the first thing is that immediately after, like within days of the alleged coup, US policymakers and their British counterparts reached out secretly to Indonesian army leaders. And they did that in order to encourage them to take advantage of the situation to destroy the Communist Party, the PKI. The army was actually hesitant to do so, and so the British and the Americans encouraged them, pushed them to move ahead. And they did this in part by assuring the army that if they moved against the Communist Party, the US and its allies would support them. The available documents make clear that the use of extreme violence in that campaign was not considered to be a problem. In fact, quite the contrary. It was expected and it was supported quite explicitly. So for example, you have an excerpt from a document from November 1965 when the killing was already in full swing. The document provides a detailed account of that army-backed killing and arrest campaign. And in this document, a senior American embassy official writes that he had, quote, made it clear to a senior Indonesian army officer that the embassy and the US government is generally sympathetic with and admiring of what the army is doing. This is just one of many instances of US and other officials explicitly encouraging the army to continue its campaign of violence against civilians. The second area of influence here is what I've described as a Psywar campaign. This, interestingly, was conducted jointly with the British, and it's the British documents that give us the best clues about what was going on. Almost immediately after October 1st, that is within a few days, the US and the UK decided to carry out jointly a psychological warfare operation to undermine the PKI, the Communist Party, and the president, Sukarno. A senior British official wrote to the Foreign Office on October 1st, as you see on the screen, I recommend that we should have no hesitation in doing what we can to blacken the PKI in the eyes of the army and the people. He further writes, the commander-in-chief has addressed himself to the chief of the defense staff on this subject. So you see that this is not a low-level operation. This is at the highest levels. In the last couple of months, a new document has surfaced, which is the letter that the commander-in-chief wrote to the chief of the defense staff on the same day, which is much more explicit and much more revealing. It says, among other things, I strongly believe that we should take a much more aggressive line to try and ensure continuing civil war in Indonesia, our aim being the destruction and putting to flight of the PKI by the army. I believe we have everything to gain by a carefully planned propaganda and Psywar activity to exacerbate internal strife. Pretty clear. So among other things, the operation involved, of course, as Psywar operations typically do, the spreading of false and highly inflammatory stories and information through the international press, but also through the Indonesian press. For example, among many other inflammatory stories, they spread the story that Communist Party women had castrated the generals before killing them, even though US and British embassy officials knew very well that those stories were false and had been cooked up by the Indonesian army. The third thing the US and its allies did was to encourage violence by providing covert economic and military assistance to the army, but not to the president, of course, just to the army. And that assistance was calibrated, I want to emphasize this, calibrated to increase as the army showed its determination to crush the PKI. Just to be clear, this assistance, which included food, medical supplies, textiles, communications equipment, and possibly weapons and ammunition, although the documents are not available yet. This assistance was gradually increased only as the army demonstrated its willingness to use violence against civilians. In other words, as the violence grew, so did the flow of US aid. One example of this assistance came in December 1965, by which time already at least 100,000 people had been killed. Against that backdrop, the US government, that is the State Department and the ambassador in Jakarta, agreed to provide a substantial amount of cash to an army-backed group that was coordinating much of the violence. That group was called Kapgestapu, and it was headed by a minister named, a civilian minister named Adam Malik, but it was definitely formed by and backed by the army. So in a telegram to State on December 2nd, 1965, the ambassador Marshall Green wrote this: "This is to confirm my earlier concurrence that we provide Malik with 50 million rupiah requested by him for the activities of the Kapgestapu movement. The chance of detection or subsequent revelation of our support in this instance are as minimal as any black bag operation can be." Fairly clear indication, not only that this was providing support to a dubious organization, but also a recognition that it was a covert and necessarily covert action, because probably illegal. In any case, aid of this kind clearly encouraged violence, both by providing funding for the operations themselves, but also by providing an indication of strong US support for that continuing campaign of violence. And finally, the US and its allies encouraged and facilitated violence through a policy of what I would call strategic silence. As an internal US State Department document said in mid-1966, it said, "Until late March 1966, our major policy in Indonesia has been silence. This policy remains sound, particularly in light of the wholesale killings that have accompanied the transition." As this and other documents make abundantly clear, the silence was deliberate, and it continued long after the US and its allies knew that civilians were being killed and detained in very large numbers. So I think it's fair to say, this is a very brief synopsis, we can say without much question that the United States actively encouraged and facilitated the violence, which, depending on one's care with the definitions, would certainly amount to crimes against humanity and possibly genocide. So where do things stand today, and what could any of us be doing about it? Well, you may know that about 20 years ago, just over 20 years ago, 3 years ago, General Suharto was finally forced to step down, and Indonesia began a transition to a kind of democracy. And so you might think that things have improved since then. But the truth is that with regard to 1965, the picture is not very pretty. More than 50 years now after the mass killings and detentions of 65, 66, no National Truth Commission has been established. No comprehensive effort to exhume the mass graves has been undertaken. No official memorials have been constructed. No apologies or reparations have been offered. No proper judicial investigations have been undertaken. No criminal charges have been brought, and nobody has been punished for the crimes committed. It's not hard to see why this is the case. After all, the perpetrators of these crimes remained in power for more than 3 decades after the fact. And in fact, the army remains the dominant political force in the country. So you could say it's still the perpetrators in power. That's permitted them to control the historical narrative and also to obstruct any move in the direction of truth or justice. But the problem has been compounded by the posture of the United States and its allies. Apart from obviously aiding and abetting the violence at the time, the US and its allies have worked hard to ensure that the truth does not come to light, even these many decades later. They've done this in three ways, at least. The first, I've mentioned before, they've refused to declassify key documents. Most notably, files from the CIA and the Defense Intelligence Agency remain classified or heavily sanitized, with a few exceptions. Secondly, the US government and former government officials have aided the Indonesian army's work of writing a falsified history by writing their own falsified history. The CIA unusually wrote a book, which they published in 1968. Since then, US officials, Ambassador Green, pictured here, and the CIA station chief wrote their own memoirs, essentially denying that the US had anything to do with this violence. And finally, the US has been conspicuously silent in failing to advocate or support any meaningful judicial process or investigation into the crimes of 1965. So you might ask why. I suppose many people here would know the reason why, but I might as well spell it out. In part, this is because Indonesia has been seen and still is seen as a vital economic, political, and strategic ally in the region. It's the fourth largest country in the world by population, the largest Muslim country in the world by population. It sits aside key sea lanes that connect the Pacific and the Indian Oceans, and it has massive mineral and oil and other wealth. In part, the silence and inaction is because of an obvious lack of sympathy for the victims in this case, who were, after all, merely leftists and communists. And in part, and maybe most importantly, the US has been silent because it was complicit in these crimes. Minimally, as I said, crimes against humanity, possibly genocide. As such, any serious demand for accountability on the part of the US would be basically putting the US and its allies in the judicial dock, which clearly they're not interested in doing. So all of this begs the question of what we could do and should do. And one answer is that we should do nothing on the familiar grounds that it would open old wounds, that we have no business telling other people how to deal with their past, and also that scholars especially should not get too involved with the issues, with political and moral questions that they study. So I would like to suggest that we breach all of these norms and say instead that there are things that we can and that we should do. And there are three that I just want to highlight here that I think may apply to all of the cases that we study today. First of all, I think we should insist that our governments help to clarify the historical record by opening their archives from this period immediately and without restriction. More than 50 years after the events, there can't be any excuse for keeping those records secret. Second, I think we should demand that our governments and relevant international bodies, including, for example, the UN Human Rights Council, encourage all credible judicial proceedings against those deemed responsible for the crimes committed. It is, I think, unconscionable that they have not yet done so. And finally, I think we should do, and we can do, through our scholarship, and whatever we can, through our scholarship, through our teaching, through our creative work, or through our direct political action to disrupt the terrible silence that has allowed these crimes to go unpunished and unnoticed for more than half a century. Thanks very much. I'll stop there.
Great, thank you. I think we're going to go directly into the second talk. So I'll just turn the screen over to Bonnie Holcomb. And again, if you have questions or comments or thoughts along the way, feel free to put them in the chat.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be invited to join the discussion. I'm grateful to the hosts and to the introduction made by my longtime colleague, Asafa Jalata. I look forward to interacting with each of you who are attending this event. I can put myself into this picture for you. I'm a child of the 1960s. While I was in college, a US president announced a military intervention into the sovereign country, Cambodia. as part of an aggressive offensive strategy in the Vietnam War. We were horrified. Our friends were being drafted. We successfully shut down the college and entered a full-throated opposition. After graduating, within months of that time, I arrived in Ethiopia for an anthropological project hosted by missionary friends and ended up encountering what I considered heavy-handed US intervention, even in the remote rural areas of Western Ethiopia. All of my reading and exposure about Ethiopia for in preparation going there was not borne out by the experience from that vantage point of a grassroots perspective from the majority population in the country, the Oromo. It was my reintroduction to the global power structure. So I eventually took up the topic in earnest and wrote the book that Asafa referred to about Ethiopia's position in the global power structure. It was co-authored by a colleague from that region who had come to virtually the same conclusion that I had reached. We'd independently determined that the best analysis of what was going on in Ethiopia was a peculiar type of colonialism that was effectively obscured by a mythology that Ethiopia was the sole independent country in Africa, the only nation that triumphed over European invaders to protect an ancient social order going back 3,000 years. I discovered that the US presence I'd encountered and I referred to as heavy-handed intervention was holding intact a system that had been put in place around the turn of the century by European powers during and after a worldwide land grab referred to as the Scramble for Africa, and the subsequent introduction of colonialism into that continent. It was widely thought that Ethiopia had escaped this process. My argument was and is contrary. So I want to share with you the gist of it, because now this book, even though published in it was written in the late 80s, published in 1990, is now in demand and is being brought back. It's like the more things change, the more they stay the same. Many of these arguments helped to explain what's actually going on there in Ethiopia right now. So we'll give some idea of what US intervention has looked like in Ethiopia, ask the question of whether this context helps us to understand, and then look at some of the lessons learned. I've tried my best to keep this paper short and the presentation within this 20-minute limit. So I'll do broad strokes. If we need to go into detail on any of these issues, we look forward to doing that. And a fuller paper if people are interested. The physical infrastructure laid out according to power relations and the extensions of European institutional influence at the time that capitalism exploded from Europe in the late 1800s, seeking new sources of raw materials and markets for the product that they were gearing up to produce in Europe, ran the boundaries of their nation states in Europe. The opening of the Suez Canal, dug by the French, eventually owned by the British, opened new vistas. Grand schemes were developed in keen competition to gain monopoly control over key routes in the continent. Cecil Rhodes is known as the industrialist who was identified with Britain's Cape to Cairo Railway Grand Plan. France planned an east-west railway scheme, of which Djibouti could be viewed as the toehold exit to the east. These plans clashed in the Horn of Africa, and the accommodation that was needed to avoid full-scale direct war was the creation of Ethiopia. We drew attention to the fact that Ethiopia, from its formation, is an artificial, not a naturally occurring entity that endured for 3,000 continuous years. It should be recognized as the creation was the result of an alliance struck between imperial powers of Europe, who were seeking to manage their own internal conflicts, and the alliance gave rise to the set of state institutions that constitute Ethiopia today. The superpower alliance between a major power and the local administrators of the state that was eventually created there is an important part of understanding what goes on in Ethiopia. The connection between these parties is a crucial sustaining component. So alliances have shifted from a connection between the Emperor Menelik, who conquered the regions at the time that Ethiopia was formed, between Menelik and France-Britain. His successor, after a couple of intervening, is Haile Selassie with Britain and then the United States. The Derg with the United States and the Soviet Union, and the previous government back to the US fold as the primary patron. The current government of Abiy Ahmed, chafing under public criticism by the US, has jumped in true Cold War fashion to sign a security agreement with China last week. So this issue is quite active right now. And we'll get to that further down. So other writers have touched on the interaction between Europe and Abyssinian leaders, but they haven't sustained the analysis that puts at the center the significance of this particular configuration. And as I said, Ethiopia is treated as an exception to the general explanations offered for development in the rest of colonized Africa and rest of colonized world. It was not an exception. In fact, it was an extension of colonial policy. And my argument is that it carried in it the seeds of a plan that was eventually used for the future of the continent. Ethiopia became a test case for what is usually called neocolonialism, corporate access to regions that had been subjugated. So Ethiopia is the name given to the geographic unit created when Abyssinia, a cluster of small kingdoms in Northeast Africa, expanded in the mid-1800s. They were empowered to conquer independent nations in the regions, many times larger than themselves, by using advanced imported firearms provided by European powers. Ethiopia refers to that empire, and Abyssinia refers to the historic homeland of Semitic-speaking residents of the group Highland Kingdom, primarily Amhara and Tigray peoples. At the time that these grand plans of the British and French clashed in the northeast corner of Africa, the working model of control was that of monopoly power. So they perceived a choice of going to war, which would have become a world war immediately, coming with some other plan. And this arrangement of accommodation is what we're looking at closely here. They employed basically a model of conflict management. So each tried indirectly to block the other from bringing supremacy, and ultimately they came with a treaty. So my point is that US intervention must be seen in this context in order to make sense of the sway that Ethiopia holds, not only in the public imagination, but also in the configuration of global economic schemes. And it was in these sets of interests that the notion of Ethiopia as an exceptional entity was born. So what actually Britain initiated was that they would deal indirectly with local leaders in that region. Both Britain and France chose to deal with Christian royalty from the northern highlands of Abyssinia. The British made a decision to back Johannes IV, an Abyssinian Tigray emperor who had assisted them during a major foray called the Napier Expedition. And the French took the liberty of supplying huge amounts of weaponry, primarily to Menelik, Abyssinian Amhara king who ultimately became emperor. His territory was strategically located at the gateway to the sources of gold, coffee, ivory, etc., which was of interest to both parties. They both flooded the country with weaponry, shipping enormous quantities of firearms to their respective clients. And one observer noted that more guns manufactured in Europe arrived in the region than there were peasant soldiers to carry them. The Italians tried to become involved on their own, shipping more arms to Menelik too, but the French were successful in hijacking that supply. So these indirect allies set out to establish dominance in this richly endowed area, well-watered homelands of the indigenous peoples, and to capture the trade routes controlled by the neighboring peoples, the Oromo, the Sidama, the Walaita, Somali, etc. When Johannes died and Menelik became full emperor, the British were left without their local ally. They couldn't act on their own behalf for reasons having to do with their relation with Egypt. So their strategy shifted to providing indirect encouragement to Italy to block France. And even the famous Battle of Adwa that was just celebrated last week between Italian and Menelik's forces, known as the occasion when Black Africans defeated the European colonizers and chased them away from their territory, was actually another one of these indirect battles between the British supplied and the French supplied forces locally. The French supplied, the British and the Italians failed at Adwa, and the French began to proceed to build the railway from Djibouti to the White Nile. So the British used means to block this. And this led to a treaty, ultimately, of 1906 among Britain, France, and Italy, called the Tripartite Treaty. The agreement stating, the great powers of Europe, France, Great Britain, and Italy shall cooperate in maintaining political and territorial status quo in Ethiopia as determined by the state of affairs at present existing, and the previous boundary agreements. So with this treaty, Ethiopia became an example of what would later prove to be a useful model of conflict management in the continent, where the superpowers dealt with a predetermined entity. The agreement was held in place by introducing a colonial mythology which exists until today. We see it actually coming into play. We'll get to how it affects even current debates. The idea of an independent, neutral Ethiopia that protected or safeguarded the interests of imperial powers in the region. It created this space, this political economic space, for what has subsequently been referred to as Ethiopian sovereignty. In that political safety zone, Ethiopian rulers were able to operate with impunity, using massive numbers of firearms and weaponry to establish dominance over the surrounding people. And these indigenous peoples experienced that process as colonial conquest and subsequent subjugation. So this became the pattern that ultimately the US stepped forward to sustain. Ethiopia survives until this day with that kind of special status, defining all relations with subjugated peoples as internal matters. Implications for this formula is that once the deal was struck, Ethiopia was blessed with the international cover as independent, exceptional, and that all that went on inside was of no concern to outside forces. They dealt with the administrators and the beneficiaries, and the state structure was developed with the assistance of their patron. So Ethiopia began to function as a junior partner of imperial nations, maintaining an alliance with a superpower, providing adequate basis for the protection of a settler class tasked for maintaining a state and extending control into areas that had been conquered, and keeping firm control over colonized majorities within those prescribed boundaries. And confronting these challenges has led to very consistent components of the Ethiopian state. Extensive use of foreign technology imported, the critical role of foreign advisors, aggressive use of this Ethiopian state mythology, which is supported by the superpowers. So the reason that I pursued the analysis, and I did it in this other writing, is that it finally explains why peoples like those whose language I learned and were resisting so hard against central control. They were not part of what had been a continuous state existing for 3,000 years. They were seeking decolonization. They were seeking it to be free of this process, the process that's understood in the rest of Africa, but not properly analyzed within Ethiopianist circles, the push for decolonization. This explained the systematic attempts to dismantle the Oromo and other Cushitic cultures that came from the center. The Oromo, those who attempted to change this state were maligned, and the efforts to protect the people to protect and develop their local cultures and all were strongly resisted by the state. And that's been misunderstood by international partners, and had been at the time of my research and continues today. So we When we look at intervention, and I don't know if the seminar series operates with a specific working definition of intervention. In the past, we used as a rule of thumb Karl Marx's argument that the colonialism and intervention is the type of intervention characterized by a change in the mode of production of the affected societies on both sides, and enforcing new relations among the constituent peoples. The impact I've mentioned on the conquered peoples is the intervention of the hard type. There are also interventions of the soft, which are pervasive and less visible. But in the beginning, writing about the dramatic and violent events that took place during the scramble for Africa were forceful, brutal interventions, and they fit the bill for defining colonial practice. What happened was set in motion then by the scramble for Africa. So we ask, in light of our theme today, what is unique about US intervention? The US intervention on the global scene entered a new dimension of leadership after World War II. For the most part, the US hadn't taken part in the scramble for what we've referred to as monopoly control. So the interpretation of what took place in the management of the colonies that had been administered by a monopoly control of superpowers is that after World War II, which turned out to be the last big war over monopoly control, Germany wanted to come and push that model forward. And the United States entering the war and bringing a new dynamic required a shift to a dominance of a different kind, a different kind of capitalism. And under this model, the disposition of the former colonies then came under the United Nations, became a collective trusteeship territory that were slated for, quote, independence or decolonization, which was defined then by the United States. What happened there is that the countries stepped away from monopoly control of their former European colonizer and became members of the United Nations as nation states. We can talk about that as rather kind of demonopolizing rather than decolonizing. But it was a very important process for establishing US dominance, establishing US intervention into areas that had been blocked off to them in the past, and in setting up a new world order. So regarding the US intervention in Ethiopia, it was a formal process. Ethiopia's Emperor Haile Selassie met with Franklin Roosevelt in 1945 and was moving to transfer to US patronage, coming with a list of demands. The timing is significant because that's when the US was coming into power. And the design that kept the imperial powers from direct conflict shifted. Even Keynes had said there should be a world bank to eliminate capitalist conflict. So the United Nations model for world order went along with the shift that Ethiopia made. I will not go into the details there. I think that this transfer is very interesting. The role of the OAU is significant in this regard. It's significant because it was housed in Addis Ababa, the Organization for African Unity, I'm saying. It fixed territorial boundaries. It was significant that the member states who championed Ethiopia's independence. They locked in the mythology that the peoples of Ethiopia remained free and unaffected by colonization. The US took on the Ethiopian patronage in those circumstances with great vigor. So here we come into the many faces. The faces that the US intervention faces and phases in Ethiopia include a whole range, toolkit of mechanisms of intervention, but the fact that they held that formula for determining Ethiopia's status relatively unexamined is significant here. I'll just do the checklist of these many faces. The physical infrastructure, the Peace Corps, the ideological support for Ethiopian exceptionalism, the championing of Ethiopian exceptionalism by the diplomatic communities, the acceptance of a kind of Abyssinian supremacy with language, religion, and culture dominant, financial instruments, land policies, the missionaries that I encountered there, mapping services, training military and police. All of this, it became, was applied to the Ethiopian state as the US moved into patron and set up a model for how this country would be introduced and be sustained on the world stage. So when we look at this, I see the time is coming. So I'll say here that the value of the kind of discussion that we have, available today and that we can get into our discussion later is to step back and take a look at the implications of this. One of the things that I have an opportunity to say in this setting is that people misunderstand the nature of what's going on in the conflict in Ethiopia because they don't know what to attribute it to. Without knowing the context, they see strong resistance to control from the center and attribute it to, hatred, ethnicity, extremism, in the past, paganism, whatever. People don't understand that the type of intervention that has occurred in the Horn of Africa, and because of that, the empowerment, and they don't understand the empowerment of the group that's now in charge of the state. They can miss the fact that these struggles are attempts at decolonization underway, carried out by once conquered peoples relegated to the periphery, deprived of infrastructure, marginalized in every sense. Their forms of resistance are efforts to claim self-assertion and expose the groups who have been their oppressors. And the struggle is familiar to other Africans who are recognized as having been colonized, but not in Ethiopia. So there's still a huge cleavage in the society between the conquered and those who take turns managing the state. There's an intense rivalry still between the Amhara and Tigray over that privilege and position. They sort of merge into an urban elite, but we see it even today. The conflict now is there for all the world to see in Tigray. And it can be interpreted in that way. There's an intense rivalry over who is going to have access to that colonial wealth and sit on top of that state. And the efforts to dismantle that, the efforts to come with another formula are pushed aside. And the fact that US foreign policy does not consider these internal historical structural problems in shaping policy comes back to mean that when the US intervenes, it miscalculates, it worsens the problem. This is what the US did in Syria. It's a failure to attend to political, historical, and structural dynamics of a country and to shape foreign policy around that. So when we get to our discussion, I think it would be very appropriate to look at what happens when the US wants security and it creates the very conditions for insecurity. It wants stability and it's arming groups and supporting those who are leading to instability. So I think that because the US is blind to its own impact when it intervenes, this is what happens when we operate without the perspective of history. We'll come back to take up what questions arise from this presentation. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I think that gives us some food for thought and some similarities and differences. And now we're going to move on to the third presentation. And I'll just to tell you, if you arrived late, we had some technical glitches at the beginning. So I think we started at least 5 minutes late. And if you're willing to stay on, we probably can go 5 minutes past and have a good 15 minutes after the final presentation. Thanks.
Okay, let's see if I can share my screen here. I never like when I share a screen that Zoom just like discombobbles my entire desktop. You can see my screen, right? I'm assuming yes?
Yes.
Okay, good, thank you. I want to talk about Ecuador, but to contextualize Ecuador, I like Badi said, she's a child of the 60s and very much of a child of the 80s. And so I want to contextualize it a little bit with my own personal experiences. And in the 80s, I worked in Nicaragua with a group, A Witness for Peace, that among other things was documenting the attacks of Ronald Reagan's Contra-terrorists trying to overthrow the Nicaraguan government, and documenting their attacks against health centers, against schools. So that this is an armed terrorist force armed by the United States government with the explicit aim of overthrowing another sovereign government. And it's a terrorist force that was targeting soft targets, civilian targets. It wouldn't engage the Nicaraguan military because it would get its asses handed to them if it attacked military targets. So it attacked soft targets instead. And this is what they called low intensity warfare, trying to undermine them. The support for the government. And in Latin America, this continues to the present. I doubt any of you know Matthew John Heath. This is something that didn't get a lot of press. This is Venezuela. In May, there was what was called the Bay of Piglets, an attempt to overthrow the Venezuelan government. This example in September received much less attention. And it's when a CIA operative went into Venezuela and tried to sabotage the country. Again, one of these efforts to overthrow a sovereign government. This is in ways how the CIA operates. They say that successful operations never get noticed. It's only the unsuccessful ones that get any attention. And the other thing that we notice out of this is that the US is not making any demands to have Heath returned. And this is a clear indicator that this is a CIA undercover operative. They send in these operatives and you get into trouble, you're basically on your own and your government is not there to bail you out. I'm contextualizing it like this because after working in Nicaragua in the 1980s and watching today what's happening in Venezuela, US intervention in Latin America is just like blatantly obvious. It's like, tell me something interesting. It's like saying water is wet or, the sky is blue. It's like, tell me something I don't know. And so when I began to study Latin America, I wanted to look at Latin America from a Latin American perspective and really get away from this perspective of empire. And so I ended up doing my research in Ecuador, in South America. And it's a place that is historically, geographically more removed from the US sphere of influence than you see Venezuela in the Caribbean Sea. Nicaragua is up in the middle of Central America, and this is an area where the US has long held dominance. Ecuador is a small country, more marginal from some of these imperial interests. And so I proceeded to do my research on the history of indigenous movements and the history of the Latin American left. And I wanted to look at how Latin Americans mobilized themselves and try to put forward their interests and their issues. To make a really long story short here, it was in 2014 where I was invited to Ecuador for a symposium on what was called the Glorious May Revolution, the 70th anniversary of this great uprising that overthrew a dictatorship and implemented a progressive government. And they asked me, could you speak about peasant movements and their role in this movement? I said, sure, I'll do that. That's what I do. That's what I love doing. And it just turned out that I was heading to DC for the American Historical Association. And in DC, this is right outside College Park, Maryland, you have the US National Archives. It's this beautiful building with this really great reading room, and you ask for these documents and they bring you these boxes and they're just full of documents. And I had been there before. I wasn't looking at US foreign relations, US Latin American international relations, but occasionally in these State Department correspondence, you find interesting documents. And so I said, well, since I'm in DC anyway, I'll go and see if they have anything on this May Revolution and the role of peasants in it. And so they bring me this box, it's like you flip the box open, you flip through it, and in the back of the box, there's this envelope, and I pull it up, And it's like, what is this? And the envelope says privilege, screen to remain classified, do not refile. And so it's like a kid in a candy store. You say, oh, I'm not supposed to look at this. It's like, I'll put it back in the box, close the box, take it back and say, there's something in here I'm not supposed to look at. Of course, that's what you do. You rip the envelope open and out pops this FBI document. And I'm sitting there and I'm just like super confused. FBI, 1942. What's the FBI doing in Ecuador in 1942? I mean, we all know the story. Maybe all of you don't know the story, but for those of you, those of us who've read about the CIA, one of the most famous kiss and tell books is this Inside the Company. Philip Agee, who also was in Ecuador in the early 1960s, it was something I had read. And it's an interesting memoir. And like most of us, we think it's like, well, the FBI is supposed to do like political surveillance in the United States. The CIA does the political surveillance outside of the United States. It's like, and there's always this bleed between the two organizations, but that's supposed to be the divide. But why is the FBI intruding on CIA territory here? And you start putting stuff together. And that's basically where I fell down the rabbit hole, which leads to like 14, what is this? This is like 7 years now where I've been digging deeper and deeper into these issues and just become more and more fascinating with this. I could go on in quite some length about this, but a really tight thumbnail sketch here. J. Edgar Hoover is the head of the FBI dating back to the 20s. He was the head of it for 50 years. He's famously anti-communist. And he's a megalomaniac. He has this huge ego. He wants to control the world. And in the midst of World War II, this is before the CIA ever existed. The CIA was created in 1947. Roosevelt divided up surveillance operations between different intelligence agencies and told Hoover, okay, FBI, you can do your political surveillance in all of the Americas. And this is how he ends up in Latin America in the 1940s. They set up this organization called the Special Intelligence Service. And they're purportedly, in 1942, the US's enemy is fascists. And so they're supposed to go to Latin America and look for fascists. There really aren't any fascists in Ecuador, but Ecuador does have a progressive history. And so Hoover is always more interested in communists. And so that's what he ends up reporting on instead of the fascists. And so he's placing his agents there in a variety of categories. A legal attaché is a legal fiction. It's like somebody working in the US Embassy. He has agents working undercover. Police training becomes one of the most brutal aspects, where the US trains police forces in other countries in torture tactics. This happens in the United States as well. Plant surveys just to make sure that organizations are run properly. The FBI, at the end of this program, it runs from 1940 to 1947. They publish a report on their activities. There's, over these years, there's, I just blinked on the number, I think 45 FBI agents in Ecuador. It's an incredible number of people that they put in this small country. The FBI has 700 agents in total in all of Latin America. And in the report, they blank out all of the names. And I don't know how well on your screens you can see this. I just want to note the third to the end, we're going to come back to this person in just a little bit. Quito, August 42 to May of 43, who was an undercover agent. I'm going to talk about him in just a little bit. And these are all men. These people who are working, some of them are working in the US Embassy, some are working undercover, which means that you're working like with Firestone or Ford or a US corporation and pretending to work with that corporation, but instead doing this political surveillance. And they don't show up in, even though that they are supposed to be part of the US Embassy, they don't show up in the foreign service lists, which is interesting because then later with the CIA, I don't know if you can see this either, but this is when Philip Agee shows up as a CIA agent, and now he shows up in the Foreign Service reports. He's the fourth name down here, and he's followed by other people who are also working with the CIA station in Ecuador. And so methodologically, this is a little bit of problem always trying to document who is CIA, and I could talk a lot more about that. But I want to talk just a little bit about some of these people. Henry Wade was this person I mentioned, the third from the bottom of the list. I'm curious, how many of you have heard of Henry Wade? How many of you who know who Henry Wade is? If I'm seeing head shaking no. Those of you with your screens off, if you know who Henry Wade is, just give me a thumbs up so I know if anybody knows who Henry Wade is. I'm not getting any positive responses. You're all liars. Like I said, he was this FBI special agent to investigate espionage. This is what his Wikipedia page says. It says in South America, it's Ecuador. He was also the district attorney of Dallas County, Texas. He was the one who as district attorney investigated the assassination of Jack Ruby's assassination of Oswald in the aftermath of the Kennedy assassination. And more famously, Henry Wade is the Wade in Roe versus Wade. Bonnie, I see your response. You have heard of Henry Wade. You are lying to me. This Henry Wade, who is the Wade of Roe and Wade, was an FBI undercover agent in Ecuador in the 1940s, and also there's a documentary called The Thin Blue Line, which in Black Lives Matter has become like a catchphrase. It's also about Henry Wade, a bit of a famous person, and how I found out who Henry Wade is. I just found this recently in the investigations in the aftermath of J. Edgar Hoover of the Kennedy assassination. There's these rumors that Oswald was an FBI informant, and Hoover is determined not to say that he wasn't an informant. And I'm not going to go into detail about this, but this document is, for me as a historian, is a really rich document because Hoover was determined that nobody knew who his agents in Ecuador were, or in Latin America were, and he completely outs Wade in the Oswald investigation and goes into quite some detail here in this document and says exactly how the FBI was operating in Ecuador, how Wade was operating as an undercover capacity with a symbol number 345, which they've blanked out in the released FBI report. And Hoover is just telling us this. And he's talking about exactly what Wade was doing and about how he would be paying for this undercover information. He had 11 informants and what he paid them, and just giving all of this really rich ethnographic detail, exactly how the FBI was operating. I could go into a lot of detail on all of this. Like all of us, I'm just kind of like skimming the surface here, but I want to flag one point. The FBI wrote these series of monographs documenting on what was happening in Latin America. And like both as Bonnie and Jeff, as you've talked about, what this basically boils down to is the FBI is saying that Ecuador is almost totally underdeveloped natural resources. She's potentially one of the richest nations in South America. And in the 1940s, in the midst of the war against fascism, the United States, the FBI, is more concerned about German economic interests than they are about like the politics or ideology. And it reaches levels of really ludicrous activity where there are Jewish refugees from Nazi Germany who end up in Ecuador, and the US captures them, kidnaps them, the FBI kidnaps them, puts them in concentration camps in Texas under guard of Nazi prisoners of war acting as their soldiers. And the FBI picks up these Jewish refugees from Germany and says, well, they claim that they're Jewish refugees, but they're really good at business and they're giving German business a good name and therefore encroaching on US economic interests. And what it really drills down to is how much of the US interest here is really economically driven. And you can, it is more complicated than that, but it's, but often the economics really underlie anything we're talking about ideology. I want to talk just really briefly about the CIA. The FBI leaves in 1947, the CIA takes over, and this is one of the first CIA agents in Ecuador. I'm not even sure now that this is his photo. Albert Haney is one of these people who just kind of disappears, and it's really hard to like find information about him. He was an assistant military attaché to Colombia. Then he's like this, one of these attachés, like these fake labels, first in Quito, Ecuador, and then in Santiago, Chile. And he's chief of station of the CIA in South Korea during the Korean War. And reports say he just makes a royal mess of that. And then Eisenhower taps him in what's called Operation PB Success. This was a CIA-backed military coup in Guatemala in 1954 to overthrow the elected civilian government, progressive government of Cobo Arbenz. And so this is the part of the trajectory that that comes out of these imperial endeavors. This is a document that I was just looking at this morning from an archival collection in Ecuador, and it's you probably can't read this. This is part of a series, and in the archive there's a whole series of these. And at first they're signed by the Ecuadorian Anti-Communist Front, and this is the first one that's signed by the Ecuadorian Anti-Communist Action. And there's a little bit of a note here at the bottom that says, well, we found that there's another organization called the Ecuadorian Anti-Communist Front, and so we're changing our name to the Ecuadorian Communist Action. And these sit in the archive as if these were legitimate documents, as if there was an organization called the Ecuadorian Anti-Communist Front, the Ecuadorian Anti-Communist Action. You read Philip Agee, remember the book, Inside the Company, that I referenced earlier on. He talks about in that book about how they were drafting these anti-communist statements in the US Embassy and putting them out in the newspapers, signing them as this until somebody actually picked up the name that they were putting out this propaganda. And that's why they had to change to this other name. And so you really see just this completely pervasive imperial heavy-handed. Bonnie, you were talking about this too, about how the US simply often just does not understand what's going on. And my interest has always really been in the social movements and what's happening on the ground. And George Jones was one of these people who was working, he's not CIA, he's State Department. He was working with Philip Agee, the CIA agent though. And this quote, he gave it toward the end of his life in an interview, reflecting back on his time in the Foreign Service. He says, we have very little relationship with the Indians. There was nobody in the embassy who could speak any of the Indian languages. And in defense of that, precisely because they had no role in the system, no influence on the system, was a very low priority for us. It just basically shows like the blatant ignorance often that underlies a lot of these imperial endeavors. Anyway, that's a really quick rapid overview. I'm out of time. Those are my book titles if anybody's interested. And thank you.
Great. Thank you so much to all three speakers. And we're gonna, a round of applause. I see virtual applause going out to all of you. I wish you could hear it in your rooms, wherever you are. We do have, I think, close to 15 minutes with a 5-minute delay to discuss specific questions that people might have to individual speakers or themes across them. And I see one coming into the chat already. And I think the other thing is that I'm going to follow Torre's procedure, which is if you'd like to speak a question, just put a question mark in the chat, and then we can call on you in order to say your questions. So, Husnul, did you want to pose your questions first, or do you want me to read them?
I cannot show my video for now because I holding my baby, so sorry.
Well, we can hear your voice if you want to say them.
Oh, okay. I just want to ask two questions. By the way, thanks, Gio, for your compelling presentations. So my first question is, do you see any like a positive possibilities to the uncovering truth? Because I mean, the Indonesian governments, they didn't admit any involvement in the killing, and also, as you said, the USA and also its allies. The second question is in 2016, if I'm not mistaken, there was like a national symposiums. They talk about the tragedy, but still there is no progress. And up to today, even the governments put emphasis to military to have like a movie show, which is also actually I look at that movie for like probably 20 years, and it's now like reversing all those nightmare. What do you think about it?
Thanks so much, Husnul, for those questions. You know, the portrait I paint is a pretty pessimistic one, and I think there's reason for that, and it's because the army is still the dominant power, and there is very little support from outside, for pressure from outside for much to change. But there is a more optimistic and positive story, and that is that from within Indonesia, not from the state, for sure, and not from the army by any means, but from civil society, from artists, from creative artists, from students, all kinds of people. There is, in the past 10 years, I would say, a much more lively and much more encouraging, demand for I hesitate to say a demand for justice, but at a minimum, a challenge to the kind of hegemonic position of the army. There have been really very interesting efforts to rewrite this history, to correct the history, to unearth a more valid history. And these have come in all kinds of sectors. So the bottom line I would say here is that in a case like Indonesia's, we shouldn't expect justice and truth to come through the state in any time in the near future. But there is hope in that direction if we look to grassroots organizations, artists, students, activists, and so on. There has been some progress in actually challenging the dominant narrative. And I think more and more, especially younger people, are really questioning that old historical narrative and pushing in some way toward some kind of demand for truth and justice. So reason for optimism. But it's not going to happen. There will not be trials, for example. There's not going to be a judicial process anytime soon.
Thanks. Asafa, you had a question I think you wanted to pose.
Yeah, I have a question. Please explain if there is change in the continuity in the USA foreign policy. It used to be against communism. Now it happened, they're also against terrorism. Now, what it tries to achieve?
Is that a question for all of us?
I
Yeah.
think it's good. All three of you actually had a thread of the material interests, but I think some of you had other nuances on top of that in terms of the ideological conflicts going on. And Bonnie, you in particular mentioned like the shift in alliances now towards China. So I think there is a question of sort of, while Marc said there's nothing new, interventions like water, everyone's seeing it. Although Jeff said, no, it's hidden. And Marc, you continue to find things hidden in the archives. So in some ways, nothing is new, but is anything new? That's the toughest question.
In Latin America, I would say that the hidden intervention isn't nearly as concerning as the overt intervention. And the most extreme example right now is the really draconian sanctions of the US government against the Venezuelan government and the longstanding sanctions against Cuba that Trump also ratcheted up, and it's not sure if Biden's going to turn them back down. Though that is what's really damaging to Venezuela. There's this media narrative that Venezuela is a socialist failure, and it's a failure because they try to implement policies to benefit their country, and the U.S. responded with an overt economic sanctions, and that's what they always do with leftist countries. And so they say, well, Venezuela is a dictatorship, so we have to respond on this issue of human rights. And you look next door to Colombia that has a extreme right, a hard right government, a pro-US government, and its human rights record is much worse than Venezuela. And nobody blinks an eye at Colombia. The US is also ramping up sanctions against Nicaragua. You look next door to Honduras. Honduras has a much worse record on objectively on all of these issues. And so I always joke to my students, it's above my pay grade to explain US policy. It's like, why did Reagan intervene in Nicaragua in the 1980s? This is a small country with 3 million people, no serious geopolitical concerns. It's like the US sees a left-wing government, a progressive government, it sees left and it just goes insane and wants to overthrow that government. And in Latin America, I don't think it goes beyond that. And if people are thinking more sophisticatedly, maybe they are concerned that a government like Cuba or Venezuela or Nicaragua are going to reorient their resources to benefit them rather than US economic interests. And so maybe they are playing a longer game in terms of wanting to maintain those economic issues. I'm not convinced that's completely the case, because like 15 years ago, Hugo Chavez significantly increased the tax take on the petroleum companies, and the petroleum companies for the most part didn't blink because they were making such out like bandits. And the Venezuelan government has never tried to nationalize. Well, the oil industry was nationalized in 1976. That really hasn't changed. The economic issues hasn't changed. Half of the Venezuelan economy is still in private hands. So saying that this is like economic issues is, this has always been the debate in like with the US intervention in Guatemala in 1954. How much of it was a fear of Guatemala going communist, which is like a complete fabrication? How much of it was a concern that the Dulles brothers were on the United Fruit Company board and they were concerned about losing their economic stake? And the answer is maybe both, that they go together, but it's always, it's an irrational fear of progressive governments, I guess, together with those economic imperial concerns. And both of them, I think, are irrational.
Irrational or powerful. Do our other panelists have thoughts on Asafa's question?
Why don't you go ahead, Bonnie? I have a quick thought, but you go first.
Yes, your question is it possible for the United States to turn against its current policies? Is that your question? Your friend Robinson, who wrote about the promotion of democracy and really raised the question to us about how this Nicaraguan situation led to the redefinition of democracy, the contested concepts that the US could support a polyarchy, a selection of individuals who could be co-opted from different groups to serve and make a country look diverse, but actually militate against participatory democracy in the process. I think he did an excellent job in spelling that out for what, where US interests lay in those years. And here we are back to the 1980s, right? I think there's going to be a really interesting test case. You know, as Paul inserted at the beginning of our discussion, the Biden administration has, number one, embraced democracy, wanting to turn on what Trump had done. The Secretary of State has come out and said that they want to call out the atrocities that are taking place in Northern Tigray. They want to make, you know, they're looking at an embrace of multilateralism and pushing and taking leadership in democracy. But these definitions are not redone. And the way that the different arms of the US government are structured is that they're not, when they're not tuned into what's going on in the country structurally, they are behind with the historical clock so that they are not able to respond. They are always behind the 8 ball. They're always managing crises rather than being even in a position to properly redefine security and stability. There's no reason, as Marc's saying, there's really no reason why the United States could not perceive a decentralized federal state in the Federal Republic in Ethiopia as a partner in a stable region with good neighborliness among the peoples who are who compose that entity. But they have not done that. It's not in principle. It is, the answer is lies elsewhere. And I think that the kinds of real interests that lie behind the stated policies are built into the system. And individuals who listen, individuals who want to make a difference end up running into obstructions and not able to advocate effectively for human rights protections, effectively for democracy, effectively for new ways of seeking security. It's a built-in commitment.
Perhaps I could just add a quick word and say, in the case of Southeast Asia, I mean, it's very complicated because there's so many different countries of different political complexions. But if I think about Indonesia in particular, there is, of course, there has been a change. The regime is remains an anti-communist regime. There's no concern really on the US part that the government is going to be turn leftist at any stage, or that the left will emerge again. It was utterly destroyed. It's not going to happen. But there is a kind of a consistent thread, really from the 1940s through until today, and that is the thread really is the economic interest. I have to say this. I mean, it's not that the other issues are not important. They are important, the ideological concerns. But if you look back to the documents from 1940s, the primary concern right after the war with Indonesia was that it is an extremely rich area in terms of oil, natural gas, gold, copper, all kinds of valuable minerals. And that was the principal concern in the 40s and early 50s. It was also a concern in the 60s because Sukarno, the left nationalist president, was nationalizing all of these industries. And so Exxon and Caltex and all the, Mobil Oil and so on were working very hard to get that to stop. Now, in 2021, the concern is at least partly about Islamist terrorism, and there's the challenge of China. So Indonesia is seen as a kind of counterbalance in the region. It's a very large country. But again, economics looms large. And if you look, I mean, I've had a chance to look at some internal documents from ExxonMobil Corporation, because they're in the middle of a lawsuit now brought by some villagers who were abused by the soldiers operating in ExxonMobil camps. And what those documents reveal, without telling any details, is just as in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and so on, the relationship between ExxonMobil and other private entities operating in the region is extremely close. That is, their relations with the military and with the US government are on a first name basis. They are frequently in meetings discussing security concerns, discussing economic strategy, and to the extent that human rights or these related issues arise, it is simply in connection with these concerns being a hindrance to security activities and a hindrance to their profit making. And so that hasn't changed in 50, 60, 70 years. That close cooperation between private industry, between the military, local military, and between the US government in securing profits.
Thanks. We're going over time, but there, I don't know if you're willing. There also was a question, Bonnie, about in the chat about teaching Ethiopian history and the mythology that you described, and asking how can we reconcile Ethiopia's image as an empire and the imagination of Ethiopia as a symbol of independence for Black students in America. Sorry, I'm reading it out from Fatuma just in the interest of time.
It's a very, very good question. It's something that we're facing with the rise of Pan-Africanism in the State Department and many of the policy circles, that there's a pride. You know, I mentioned that the Battle of Adwa was celebrated last week as an occasion of Black pride pushing European colonizers out. They did not push European colonizers out. And I think it's very important to focus on the fact that the rulers and the subjects are Black in Ethiopia, and that the people, those who are actually holding a position, I would even go so far as to say similar to white supremacy in America in relation to the other members of their country, provides an opportunity for people who are interested in Black solidarity and Black alliance to see the difference and to become sophisticated about those relationships and not have that blind side that is making policy go awry in that area.
Asafa, did you have more you wanted to raise, or should we wrap up?
Yeah, I think so.
I have like about a dozen questions in my head, but I'm afraid we're over the time allotted for this formal Zoom session. I wish we were all together so we could go have a drink and chat some more about these details in person. Hopefully that will happen someday in the coming months, and that it won't be a whole nother year. I want to thank Jeff Robinson, Bonnie Holcomb, and Marc Becker again for giving such insightful presentations, and my colleague Asafa for helping co-organize today's session. You may see a survey coming from me in the coming weeks. I'm kind of curious what everyone thought of not just today's session, but the whole year sessions, if you made it to other ones, and what you're interested in for the coming year, because the organizing committee, and Tamara is now here as well, as I acknowledged earlier, we'll be meeting and thinking about what we want to do going forward in the future. Thanks everyone for a great session. I really appreciate it.
Wish you well. Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, thanks very much, Paul and
Thank you very much. We are ready.
and Bonnie and Marc. Great.
Thank you.